Now, Kevin Marr is our go-to man for events in Parliament, former parliamentary factotum himself, and connected to the political process in all kinds of ways. Kevin Marr joins me now. Kevin, you were a former Labour advisor. Are you surprised that Keir Starmer is 9 points clear of Boris Johnson in today's opinion polls?
Well, that was the week that was, George. It's been a howler of a week for Boris Johnson. So I think it would be inevitable if there wasn't electoral polling ramifications for the week that he's had. And indeed, that's what we've seen in the last 48 hours. We've seen a slew of polls that have put a Labour lead now between 4 and 9 points. So something has changed this week. I think everybody can sense it. It's not quite end of days for Boris Johnson. That will come, I think, if enough of his backbench MPs feel that over a period of weeks or months, the government can't get its act together, that it's accident prone and that it's behind in the polls in a structural sense. And that would therefore mean that they would lose their seats in any forthcoming election. I think that's the point when his own side will move against him. And I think at some stage they definitely will. I mean, it was reminiscent of for me slightly this last week of that week that you'll be very familiar with in September 1992, when John Major's credibility was smashed on the rocks on Black Wednesday. And although he stayed in power for another 4.5 years, when that reckoning came in May 1997, it virtually destroyed the Conservative Party. It was their worst ever election defeat in the 20th century. So I think with governments, once you start slipping and sliding, you've got to either correct that very, very quickly and be very bold in how you do that and recognise that you're slipping and sliding, or it tends to just carry on. And if it carries on, then it becomes very, very difficult to re-establish trust and credibility, I think, with the electorate. And I think Boris Johnson has kind of forfeited so much trust and credibility this week with the revelations that have come out of the various parties and social gatherings and little tete-a-tetes that were taking place in Downing Street and in other government departments, right at the time when, of course, the rest of us were being told to socially distance, to not have parties, to not have gatherings, to not see our families, and all the rest of it. And it's that double standard. It's that sense of just rampant hypocrisy, which is very, very damaging for any political leader. And I think that's what stuck to him this week. And I think from the Labour side, there's been a kind of scratching of heads for quite a long time about Boris Johnson. How do you land punches on this very strange political character that has won quite convincingly 2 years ago today, won an 80-seat majority? The bumbling and the kind of affectations that he has, which made him very, very difficult to kind of characterise and attack. And I think what he's done this week is frankly just do it to himself. And I think Keir Starmer's instinct is to sort of sit back a little bit, let him carry on slipping and sliding. He's got this review into the allegations about these parties that the cabinet secretary is now obliged to undertake. There's got to be some conclusion to that. I think it's very hard to conclude anything other than parties took place and people were at them and who knew about that. That's going to stick and that's going to last as political damage. And one of the things that struck me so much this week is with one foot outside the kind of the political camp. I mean, I look at my social media feeds and family and friends and people who are not usually commenting on political matters. Everybody's been commenting on this. Everybody's been sharing these memes and these cartoons and these bits of footage about the parties in Downing Street. It's done real lasting damage. And I think there's, as I said, there's a palpable sense that something has changed this week. And if it's not immediate curtains for Boris Johnson, then this is the point, I think, at which his premiership is in a terminal stage.
How much would a Conservative defeat on Thursday in North Shropshire affect the whole picture, Kevin?
I think that really would bring things into focus. Now, I mean, on the numbers, you would say it's very difficult to see them doing anything other than holding that seat. Probably with a very reduced majority, probably with a few squeaky moments over coming days. But it would be very hard to foresee the Conservatives losing that. If they did, if they were to lose it, then all things are on the table, I think, at that point. Because if you can lose places like that, then all these other Conservative MPs, many of whom with very small majorities, those in the red wall areas in the north of England and in the East and West Midlands, they would be looking and saying, well, if we can lose places like in Shropshire, then my seats, I'm a goner. And at that point, it becomes very difficult to instill discipline in the parliamentary party. And I think that's going to take up a lot more time, regardless, for Boris Johnson this week. He's been very cavalier in his approach to being Prime Minister. He's very poorly briefed on pretty much any issue, doesn't do very much media, has obviously struggled with COVID and dealing with the fallout of Brexit and all the rest of it. And I think if he really had to try much harder to win around his parliamentary colleagues on lots of tight votes that will come up, then I think there comes a point for somebody like Boris that what do you actually enjoy about this job? Because governing is hard. It's often very unglamorous. These are very long hours. Lots of things can go wrong. And I think there comes a point with characters like him that are a kind of slightly kind of flibbity-gibbet characters where they say, what is it that I enjoy about being Prime Minister? Because it probably isn't this. And I think that may hasten his departure as well. He may want to go at some stage under his own terms, perhaps saying, look, I've managed to see off COVID and secure Brexit. I've got my little place in history. After that, what's the point in hanging around, really?
Yes, well, let's turn to one of those tight votes. There are scores of Conservatives already registered that they will not support the lockdown COVID measures that are coming up in the Commons this week. He would therefore lose that vote if it wasn't for the fact that Keir Starmer is going to support him, showing at the very least that he doesn't really have the killer instinct, Keir Starmer. Well, what's your take on that?
I think Labour's in a bind because one of the great strategic weaknesses that the party's got and that Keir Starmer is probably rightly obsessed about is the sense of competence and acting in the national interest and all the rest of it. Now, perhaps that's a dilemma for all opposition parties. You're trying to prove that you should change positions with the governing party. So you want to try and emphasise how seriously you take issues. So I think it's interesting to hear Labour politicians reference the support that they're likely to give the government this week on its kind of Plan B proposals for a sort of soft lo-fi lockdown. They're talking about backing the chief medical officer and the chief scientific advisor. They're framing it very much in that sense that we're not backing Boris Johnson, we're not backing the health secretary, we're backing the expert advisors. If their expert advice is that we need to take further measures to limit the transmission of Omicron, then we'll do that. And if that means that we end up backing the government, then that's the kind of the secondary motive. I think that's the Labour position. But it's very interesting the fact that there are obviously lots of Conservative MPs that are very restive about this, that have been very sceptical throughout about what measures are in fact needed and are any of these measures excessive to actually meeting the challenge. And I think there'll be a few of them that will be pondering whether the kind of the Plan B measures that we've seen, and Boris Johnson, of course, is due to address the British public tonight, how much of this is theatre to try and address what has been a very disastrous week politically. It's a very dangerous game because, as I say, these two issues are intimately connected. That people in Downing Street have been messing around with their parties last year, and then are asking us again to take fairly draconian measures ahead of Christmas. And for lots of people in the country, they will be saying, "Well, why should I? Because you didn't do it." And I'm not necessarily convinced that the measures are proportionate to the risk. So it starts to affect the entire public health strategies, to be honest. And I think that there are a lot of Conservative MPs that are very, very sceptical about how effective some of the lockdown measures have been. And if they decide to vote against the government this week and Boris Johnson only survives because of the votes of Labour MPs, then again, it will add to a sense of malaise at the heart of government. And it will put Boris Johnson and lots of his parliamentary colleagues on a different track, which again starts to become very difficult to manage in the weeks and months ahead, not only in relation to COVID, but to some of the Brexit issues that we're still dealing with, the Northern Ireland Protocol, for example, and some of the other difficult legislative issues that he's got as well. If there's a chunk of his parliamentary party that ends up in a different place repeatedly, then some of these people might start to ask, is he the Prime Minister for us?
Finally, Kevin, I'm grateful for your time as always. Let's look into the crystal ball. Boris is no confidence or decides that, frankly, this isn't worth the salary on which he can't live in any case, certainly can't pay his alimony off that salary and bring up his growing family, addition born this week, of course. Let's look into the crystal ball. If Boris either walked or was pushed, who would your money be on as the next Tory leader and thus Prime Minister for the next 2.5 years?
It's a difficult one. I think if you were to say what's the batting average of somebody that takes over as Prime Minister while the government, if you like, is in office, then you always look to the Chancellor and the Foreign Secretary as the most likely candidate. So we're told apparently today that Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, is in the background, sort of on manoeuvres, as they say, with a view to this as well. But I think if you look at people like Dominic Raab, they're not compelling political figures. The First Secretary of State, effectively Deputy Prime Minister. I think it is pretty thin gruel. I suspect Rishi Sunak is seriously undercooked as a political figure. He seems very gauche. Seems very. I think it would be very difficult for him to step up. I think the smart money at the moment might be on Sajid Javid. Now, as I say, the difficulty for him as Health Secretary is he's got an advantage and a disadvantage. His advantage is he does appear as a serious person, which in a government of people who are not desperately serious sometimes sets him apart. The difficulty he's got is that, as I say, some of those backbenchers don't want any more of these lockdown measures, and Sajid Javid will go with the scientific advice and bring them through. So it's a question really of what's the reason that Boris Johnson goes? Is it a sense of that he's just an unserious person, and therefore do you address that deficit with a serious person? And as I say, my money would probably be on Sajid Javid to fulfil that role, or do they want an ideological figure to kind of take things forward? And
well, let me put a dark horse. Let me put an ideological dark horse to you. The dog that didn't bark, to mix the metaphors. Michael Gove hasn't been seen or heard of for some time. What about if he's, politically speaking, drying out and getting ready for, and he's quite in the habit of plunging in the political dagger. What about Michael Gove seeking to take over, and very soon?
Michael Gove, I think, intellectually and in many respects politically, is kind of head and shoulders above most of the cabinet. I think Michael Gove's difficulty, it's a terrible kind of reflection on the superficiality often of politics and presentational politics. He kind of just doesn't look the part. And that seems a very blunt and very unfair assessment. But I'm reminded of exactly the same characterization of Robin Cook.
You've taken the words right out of my mouth. But Robin Cook said to me,
looks like a garden gnome.
Yeah, when I asked Robin, why don't you run? He said, people think I'm too ugly. And I looked across at John Major and I said, how handsome do you have to be?
It's terrible. It's so superficial. I mean, Michael Gove is, a feline political operator and intellectually smart and perfectly capable. But I think he tends to kind of, he presents himself in a certain way which people draw very stark conclusions straight away, is the kindest way of saying he's a bit ugly.
Plug. Well, look, Kevin, thank you very much indeed for that tour of the horizon. I'm sure you'll be watching Boris address the nation at 8 o'clock, but most of my audience would prefer to be addressed by me. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.